So a further 17 hostages held by Hamas were released yesterday. Amongst those, Abigail Adan. She turned 4 on Friday. She is dual Israeli and US nationality.
Yes, Abigail was one of the hostages released in exchange for 39 Palestinian prisoners from Israel.
Since Friday, a total of 58 have been released, mostly women and children. That includes citizens also from Russia, from Thailand and the Philippines.
Well, Gazans have been using the pause in fighting to get desperately needed supplies of fuel, food and medicine. And earlier we spoke to Matthew Morris, a spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross, about the humanitarian situation.
The intensity of the fighting in Gaza has meant that humanitarians have obviously struggled to do what is needed. And we know, I'm sure your viewers who've been following this in recent weeks have known how difficult it is to get aid supplies in, but also to get people out, medical evacuations, for example.
Hamas says it's now seeking to extend the current truce, which is a 4-day truce, and increase the number of hostages released, a position international leaders, including the US, are supportive of.
So I'm hopeful this is not the end. It's going to continue. But we don't know. And but I get a sense that all the players in the region, even the neighbors who aren't and have been directly involved now, are looking for a way to end this so the hostages are all released and Hamas is completely, how can I say it, no longer in control of any portion of Gaza.
However, Israel's Prime Minister has told President Biden that his forces will resume their campaign in Gaza with full force once this temporary truce comes to an end.
In London yesterday, let's have a look at what happened there. An estimated 100,000 demonstrators against anti-Semitism walked along Whitehall protesting against the rise in hate crimes in the UK since the October 7th attack in Israel.
Well, among the thousands were prominent journalists, entertainers and politicians, including the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who spoke to us.
What we're all doing here, and the only thing we're really doing, is showing solidarity with Jewish people. And that's necessary because since October the 7th, I'm afraid there's been a very peculiar response in many parts of the world, including, I'm sad to say, in London. And what we've seen is I'm afraid the re-emergence of anti-Semitism and a failure to focus on the appalling terroristic acts of Hamas.
Before you ask, we have no idea what his hat says either. Is it FC something? Is it GT? Is it a football club? FC stands for football club. GT Grand Tour. No idea. Our reporter Charlie Peters.
Grimsby Town.
Grimsby Town? Oh, what would he be associated with Grimsby Town for?
Someone obviously lent him a hat, I think. It was a bit chilly. Anyway, to the message. I mean, we could start by talking about that, or do you want to go? Should we get an update on the hostage situation first, Charlie? Because we're hearing now that Hamas would like this truce to be extended. It sounds as though President Biden's supportive of that idea. The big question is whether or not President Netanyahu will be, or Prime Minister.
It seems to be he's the bloc against the extension of this ceasefire, which is now, of course, in its final day today. This has been useful for Hamas, as we mentioned in the intro there, more supplies coming into Gaza for humanitarian reasons. But as we know, it's almost certainly the case that they are taking some of the fuel for their own military ambitions. But that ceasefire, while frustrating for the Israeli military mission, it will have been useful for them as well. A chance to reposition their forces, re-administer some logistical supplies. You know, that has been a significant struggle for the Israelis since October the 7th, but also to gain more intelligence. So since this war started, especially in Gaza, when that invasion took place, there were major intelligence gaps. Where are the hostages and where are the enemy forces? And we have seen several times when the Israelis have just got it wrong.
Well, the Israelis have got it wrong, but are they in control or not?
They are losing control of this war as it stands. This ceasefire has been an important period for them to reposition their forces. And some of those hostages that we've seen released have been released in northern Gaza, an area that Israel should really have under control at this point. It is the immediate objective of their invasion. And before they can turn their attention to the south, where they've forced millions of people into that tiny corridor, that humanitarian corridor on the coast, they need to have security in the north before they can take that mission south. That is a significant struggle, and as it stands, they don't have the control of that location.
Whilst you're talking, Charlie, we're looking at the emotional pictures that we got over the weekend. There's Emily Hands with her father, dual Irish Israeli. And, you know, I suppose behind a lot of what happens next will be the time it takes to hear from the hostages about what they will have intelligence to share, won't they? Their experience, where they were held, what it was like. And depending on what they are told, that might also influence what happens next from the Israeli perspective.
And we've heard very little of the information that they have passed over. Of course, the Israelis keeping that security information very tightly controlled. Yesterday, I spoke to Mirit Regeva, the mother of Maya, who was released yesterday, rushed into hospital for surgery on her leg, urgent surgery. She had a gunshot wound, suffered 50 days ago, so very badly infected. The latest I heard that the surgery was successful. She hasn't lost her leg, so that's a great piece of news. But now the attention will turn to Maya and the other children and young girls and women who were released. What do they know? Where were they taken? Were they in tunnels? Did they know if they were in the north? Sensory deprivation would have definitely been something that these hostages endured. So how much information and intelligence kind of products they can produce and assist the Israelis in producing will be difficult to do.
How many hostages will remain once this ceasefire is over, will remain in enemy hands?
Well, over 150 as it stands. And we have seen the Israelis under significant pressure from the families of those hostages since the war started, especially on Benjamin Netanyahu. How will you get these hostages released? And it's been interesting to see the psychological operation by the Israelis on Hamas to try and turn those tables around, saying for every 10 hostages you release, we will release these Palestinian prisoners, playing the same game to see perhaps if they can get some Palestinian families to apply that pressure to Hamas and saying, look, if you do this, you know, my mother, my father will be released.
The danger, though, in all of this, Charlie, is that there could be a number of hostages that are lost, that are dead, that are unaccounted for, and Israel will not stop until they can find them. And I know that in the past there's been up to something like 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released in exchange for just one Israeli hostage. So, you know, not to be pessimistic, but there is a horrible feeling that this could go on and on and on whilst they wait for the remaining 150, and they will not stop, will they, Israel, until they're all accounted for?
There is no doubt that the next phase of this military operation will be into the decisive phase to try and to take the whole of Gaza. But the main struggle that the IDF will have now is that those Hamas forces will have been adopting defensive positions in the south and blending in with those civilian forces. Their goal is to destroy Hamas, but most military analysts around the world now say that's quite impossible, because once you destroy the leadership, if you can, people who would have taken off their uniforms and returned to civilian life will bring them back on as soon as you leave.